Welcome to video number 12, Taxation Without Representation. We enter now into, in my opinion, what is probably the most fascinating period of time here in the American continent, maybe second only to the time where Captain Moroni raised the title of liberty. And the 1700s were full of characters that were all about their freedoms and liberties. These men and women were abjectly all about the freedom. A period of time where, frankly, the English Parliament didn't care about the colonists, and they certainly gave no thought to their representation back in England. Remember, most of these colonists were still Puritans or a descendant of a Puritan or had been raised around Puritans. And as John Adams put it, the Puritans were the bearers of freedom. And during the 1720s, 30s, many of these men and women were born and raised under the rule of English law and a parliament that so many grew to despise. By the mid-1760s, they were passing so many new laws, taxes, acts that were obstructive that colonists were finally forced to react to a government intent on suppressing them and harming them. The Sugar Act of 1764 was the first of these. It followed the 7-Year War against the French, a result of the debt incurred during that war. And Britain was trying to recover some of the costs of that war. The reality was, however, that there was no colonial representation in Parliament, and these taxes were fairly easy to levy against the colonists. And the problem was the collection of these taxes. And this particular act, the Sugar Act, began most notably to finally enforce the collection of these taxes that up until now, they could get around in their imports. They could offload at night. They could do different things. They could get around the taxes. And so this began a long argument of taxation without representation and was a violation of their perceived rights as Englishmen. The Sugar Act was followed in 1765 by two additional taxes and acts, being the Stamp Act and the Quartering Act. The Stamp Act was simply a tax levied on the paper used for printing. This was easy to identify as the paper had to carry a valid tax, indicating the tax had been paid. The Quartering Act obliged the colonists to quarter or to house the regular British troops to live. They had to let them live in their inns, their barns, sometimes in their in their homes, in fact, and certainly in their public houses that they had. This was also intended to defray the cost of maintaining a military force of regular British forces of almost 10,000 men. And so this was quite obstructive in this whole process. The last act that came in was the Revenue Act of 1767, and it was an indirect tax placing heavy duties on goods imported into the colonies, anywhere outside of what the British were bringing to them. So it was a heavy tax that they had to pay. Now, before we get into how the colonists resisted or fought against these taxes, we need to recognize that the people there then were very much like we are today, right? Some were vocal, some were intent on resistance, while the rest were ambivalent, right? They were neutral. They didn't care. They didn't see any reason to argue or fight against all of this. And they didn't want to be involved. It's exactly how it is today. I mean, we've got so many people that just don't want to be involved. They want to stay neutral. They don't want to cause waves. And so here today we have a House and a Senate, president constantly trying to raise and put new laws in place, restrict many of our constitutional rights, enforcing laws, or trying to create laws, but yet they don't enforce the laws that are already on the books. So we're in a very similar situation to how the colonists were back then. As we look at these politicians trying to go around the First and the Second Amendment and destroy our liberties, and we find a very few people that are trying to resist and fight, where the vast majority are asleep and don't want to engage. Those colonists, like we are today, we're at a breaking point, and I feel it today. We're at a breaking point, and what will be the final catalyst that forces our hand to get more people to resist. And I say this to those asleep here in our country and indifferent to the situation we find ourselves in, from the words of the great Samuel Adams: "If ye love wealth better than liberty, the tranquility of servitude better than the animating contest of freedom, go home from us in peace. We ask not your counsels or your arms. Crouch down and lick the hands which feed you. May the chains set lightly upon you, and may posterity forget that you were ever our countrymen." Jus meum tabor.